Stanford University.
Well, thank you, Riley. That was a very, very generous introduction. You were kind enough to mention the Pulitzer Prize that came my way back in 1993. And I think I should share with all of you my fondest memory of that. One of my sons was in junior high at the Jesuit Academy in Detroit, and he went to school the next day and he told his teacher that his dad had just won the Pulitzer Prize. He had it about right in my case. I'm really honored to be with you because I think we all share a passion, and because I'm really very excited about the work that's begun here by the Revs Institute, because the automobile really is a subject that's worthy of study in so many ways, mechanically, humanistically, and culturally, design, and every sort of major issue in our society, ranging from technology to environmental issues to globalization, all kinds of macroeconomic issues. You can really slice into those issues through the automobile. And what I try to do in Engines of Change really is look at 15 cars that had a defining impact on how we think and live as a people. So these cars are not the best cars in American history, not the worst cars, but they're important cars culturally. And part of the genesis for this book, really came, years ago when I was a kid. I would read National Geographic magazine, and they would have all these articles, things like, what the spoons of the ancient Etruscans could tell us about, the lives of the ancient Etruscans, right? So I thought, well, it'd be fun to do an article or do a book about certain automobiles that had a defining impact, because I think they're probably more fun and maybe more interesting than spoons, if you will. I hope so. So I'm going to show you here the, if I can make this work. Oh, there we are, right. The list of automobiles that I cover in the book. And again, they're not the best cars or the worst cars, but cars that had a defining impact on life and thought. And just to step back for a minute, just forget about cars. Let's talk about American culture. For the past century or so, it's been, in fact, even longer, I think, American culture has been defined by this tug of war, a fundamental tug of war between the practical and the pretentious, between the ordinary, the ostentatious, uptown versus downtown, Saturday night versus Sunday morning, all that kind of thing. And it's uniquely reflected in these cars, which generally fall into one of those other categories, and it sort of alternates depending on what sort of comes into vogue, what the times are like in which these cars existed. The first one is, of course, the Ford Model T, which is an obvious choice for this book. It debuted in October 1908. I suspect people here know that the reason it was called the Model T was because it followed models N, R, and S. Therefore, T is logical. When it debuted, it was only $850 to buy, which was less than, most other cars of the day were above $1,000. But it was not the cheapest car of the day. That honor went to a car called the Brush Everyman's Car, or Brush Runabout, which only had a one-cylinder engine as opposed to the 4 cylinders in the Model T. And the Brush's chassis and frame and wheels were made of wood, not of steel. In fact, a popular quip of the day went, wooden axle, wooden wheels, wouldn't run. Okay? So it's clear why Henry Ford won this battle. He made his Model T out of a new kind of steel imported from France, vanadium steel. That's right, Frederick, exactly. Vanadium steel that really flexed with the road as opposed to sort of barged through, potholes. I mean, they had potholes back then. I mean, kind of like now. So this lightweight material really flexed with the road. Henry Ford, his favorite joke really was about the farmer who asked to be buried in his Model T Ford because the car had gotten him out of every hole he'd ever been in. 5 years later in 1913, Henry Ford starts the moving assembly line in the Highland Park factory, which is shown here. It was inspired actually by the disassembly lines of Chicago and the stockyards. And that's where Henry's engineers went and sort of saw this process and basically reversed the disassembly lines and put together the assembly line in Detroit. And less than a year later, in January 1914, he instituted the $5 day. Frankly, it was as much of a marketing move as it was a humanitarian move. And it brought him incredible publicity, and it more than paid for itself. The average factory wage at the time was about $2.63 per day, so $5 was a considerable increase. And Henry Ford's marketing strategy was very simple, just more and more manufacturing efficiency, and therefore lower the cost. Year by year by year, the cost went lower, just like computer chips today. And so by the early 20s, in 1924, you could buy a Model T for only $260. But things were happening in America, and Henry Ford missed a big trend. We were an increasingly urban society. The Roaring '20s were not called roaring for nothing. There was a lot of wealth in America, and people began to think of automobiles as vehicles not just for physical mobility, but also for social mobility. And he just didn't catch on to this. He was really wedded to his business model. And along came General Motors with a different idea, and that is to sell cars as symbols of status as well as vehicles for transportation. And so the second car I chose in this book really is the LaSalle, which is probably a long forgotten brand even to many people in this room. Only existed for 14 years, 1927 to 1940. It was the first mass market designer car done by Harley Sloan. It was sort of the first yuppie car, if you will. It was really for young, wealthy people of its day. And you can see it looked rather different than the dowdy old Model T. It's actually beautiful, frankly. And what really happened here is that in the early years of the last century, Henry Ford invented mass manufacturing. Alfred Sloan of General Motors and Harley Earl of General Motors invented mass marketing. And you just think about this, you probably have mathematicians here at Stanford, and if you were going to say all this in an equation, you'd say mass production plus mass marketing equals mass consumption, which equals modern America. So guess what? Not a lot has changed since then, if you will. This was I don't know if any of you remember the sitcom All in the Family from Archie Bunker from the 1970s. The fourth line of the introductory song was, "Gee, our old LaSalle ran great." And people didn't know what that was referring to because most people never heard of the LaSalle, but that's what it was right here. So I really sort of skipped a couple of decades after that. I skipped the 30s and the 40s because we had a couple things happen that were not conducive to automobiles shaping the culture. We had a depression, and then we had World War II, so people were concerned with other things. But here we are in 1953, which is a seminal year in our history. It was the year that Elvis Presley began his recording career. It was the year that Hugh Hefner started Playboy magazine. It was the year the Korean War ended. So you had this peace and prosperity sort of breaking out for the first time. Ike went to the White House, President Eisenhower. A young congressman named Jack Kennedy went to the U.S. Senate. The Saturday Evening Post had a cover story that said, "JFK, the Senate's gay young bachelor." I think we know differently now, or I think it was only in the 50s sense of that term, let's put it that way. But you get this picture of a nation, a generation of people that had grown up knowing privation, right? Depression and war. All of a sudden we had peace and a little prosperity, and people wanted to let loose a little bit, and along comes the Corvette. And the first Corvette is pictured here. And of course it was a disaster. I mean, it had an anemic 6-cylinder engine, a 2-speed automatic transmission. The roof leaked so badly that several buyers drilled holes in the floor to let the water leak out, so that solved that problem, right? And a year later, General Motors was about ready to discontinue this car. And the guy that rides to the rescue is Zora Arkus Duntal, which is really remarkable. He was born in Brussels, but he was 2 months old. His parents, who were Russian, moved back to St. Petersburg, and he was raised during the Russian Revolution. His parents were Bolsheviks. They were later posted to Berlin as diplomats, and so they all fled just ahead of the Nazis after the Nazis invaded France and started World War II. So Zora makes his way to America and finds himself at General Motors. He's enamored with the Corvette, and he pleads for the life of this car. And his memos are wonderful. One of them, of course, is titled "Thoughts Pertaining to Youth, Hot Rodders, and Chevrolet." And it's sort of an odd mixture. The language is sort of this odd mixture of corporate speak and immigrant English, okay? So it's not elegant, but it's powerful. And he convinced General Motors to keep the Corvette going, and it really became the iconic great American sports car. One of the more interesting things is this all happened during the Red Scare era in America, and at the first Corvette factory in Flint, Michigan, there was an incident in which a young worker who professed communist affiliations was dragged out of the assembly line and beaten up by his fellow workers. He was identified as a communist in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. They had a hearing in Flint, Michigan, and the Detroit Times, a long-deceased newspaper, identified his accuser as a woman who was, quote, a Flint grandmother and FBI spy. I mean, go figure that one. But I always figured that if Senator Joe McCarthy had known that it was a Bolshevik boy who saved the Corvette, this car would have been the commie plot, okay, as opposed to the great American sports car. They don't make cars like this anymore, do they? I mean, how cool is that? Okay, cool, very cool, thank you. I think tailfins were obviously the most powerful symbol of America's post-war sky's the limit optimism, and the story behind these is really fascinating. Harley Earl introduced them, but they were just little baby finlets on the 1948 Cadillacs. GM was so nervous about this that it actually had alternate rear fender plans drawn up in case the finlets didn't catch on. But the public, Harley Earl was right, and people accepted these fins, and it was sort of that way for a few years. And then a man named Virgil Exner took over design at Chrysler, which was really hurting at the time, and put big fins on the 1955 cars, and they were a smash success. Chrysler's market share went from 13% to 18% in 1 year. All of you in the car business know what that means. It's almost impossible. In the first 2 months of 1955, Chrysler actually made more money on its net income bottom line than it did for all of 1954 because it had bigger fins. And they put still bigger fins on the 55s, the 56, 57s. Ironically, these were sold as safety devices, right? There's a lot of engineers in this room who are snickering, but if you go back and look at the old sales brochures of the day, the exact term is graceful directional stabilizers. I kid thee not, okay? Pretty remarkable. They claim to actually have wind tunnel tests to prove this, but the funny thing, there was the business school of another prestigious university, Harvard University, was so enamored of this that they invited Virgil Exner to give a very prestigious endowed lecture at Harvard. And the original text of that lecture is preserved today at the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, which is kind of neat. Anyway, the rest of the story is that by 1957, General Motors was getting worried about this, and a young designer named Chuck Jordan got a sneak preview of the soon-to-be-introduced 57 Chrysler models, and tore back to his office and went into Bill Mitchell's office, who was the #2 man in design, and said, "Look, Bill, we're about to get outfinned." Okay? And General Motors just decided that this little upstart company is not gonna pull this over on us. So I was fortunate enough to have interviewed Chuck before he died about a year and a half ago. And he told me these fins you see here were actually, let me put it this way, they designed the first clay model, they stepped back, and they realized that the first fins they designed were actually taller than the roof line of the car. These are the scaled down fins, okay? And as Bill Mitchell put it in a memorable quote, taking the fins off a Cadillac is like taking the antlers off a deer. You got a big rabbit. So, anyway, fins really sort of petered out in the mid-'60s, but meanwhile, again, pretentious, now back to practical, this vehicle was coming into vogue. And it's just a remarkable story how Hitler's car could become the hippie icon. I mean, who would have predicted that? The original name of this car, a lot of people here probably know it, was the Kraft durch Freude Wagen, pardon my German, which means strength through joy car. It's a stupid name, right? But the Fuhrer decreed this name himself, and nobody wanted to argue with him. I can't figure out why. But anyway, the car survived the war, and VW was sort of in business with uncertain ownership. A few GIs started to who were posted in Europe, brought their Beetles back to America. People liked them. Volkswagen actually started selling in America, not because it wanted to appeal to hippies. There weren't hippies in the early 50s. It was a very practical business need. They needed hard currency, dollars, to buy American machine tools. Hard to believe they were the best machine tools in the world at that time. But anyway, that's why they started selling cars in America. And what really made these things take off, especially as cultural icons for the counterculture, is the irreverent advertising that was begun by Doyle Dane Bernbach, the advertising agency, the original Mad Men in the late 50s and early 60s. I mean, Detroit never would have said lemon in an ad. You wouldn't even say lemon in polite speech in Detroit. But that's the term Volkswagen used on this ad that told the story about how this car had a defect, but we caught it in time and we fixed it before it went out for sale. This next ad over here, now remember this is 1963, before the women's movement had begun. So the headline on this ad is, "Do you have the right kind of wife for it?" They don't do advertisements like that anymore, okay? When you read the text of the ad, by the way, it's actually really about a woman who thinks for herself, who's got an independent mind and does not follow the crowd, but you don't get that message from the headline necessarily. A couple of my other favorite ads, I mean, people here have probably seen the one, the famous one in 1995 when Jerry Garcia died with a microbus with the teardrop coming out of the headlight, excuse me. The next one here was created by a guy that I had this ran in 1971 by Bob Cooperman, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing. He later became chairman of DDB. And someone had basically called him in his office one day and told him that, he said, frankly, a hillbilly couple out in the Ozarks, their mule died, and they got a Beetle to replace the mule. So Bob hops on a plane, flies out, knocks on the door of this log cabin, no running water. Mr. Redmond Hensley comes to the door and runs to get his shotgun. He thinks a city slicker's here to steal his land, okay? So they got it all calmed down, and they did this marvelous ad. It's really American Gothic style, of course, with the pitchfork and the Beetle and the log cabin, and the great headline, "It was the only thing to do after the mule died." Honestly. So how good is that, right? Anyway, so these became beloved of the counterculture in America. Ironically, the Beetle was priced at a range which most people could afford. Poor people would never buy Beetles. They bought the biggest used Detroit car they could find. Rich people, Paul Newman had 5 Beetles, right? I mean, basically, poor people did not want to look poor. Rich people did not want to look rich. I mean, go figure. Sort of true today, by the way. These are 2 covers of Time magazine that ran a decade apart, and this is actually one of my favorite chapters in this book. It's about the Chevy Corvair, GM's answer to the Beetle. It was also rear-engine car, air-cooled rear engine, but it had a lot of weight on the back end. Introduced as a 1960 model in the fall of '59. At this cover story, Ed Cole told the reporter, it's a quote from the cover of Time, "If I felt any better about our new Chevy Corvair, I think I'd blow up." It's true. And the car, sold okay for a few years. It didn't outsell the Ford Falcon, its arch rival. But then in 1965, a young unemployed and unknown lawyer named Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed. The book was a flop. It was going nowhere. Until the New York Times revealed that GM had hired private detectives to spy on Ralph Nader. And only after that did things really take on a life of their own. There were congressional hearings called. Jim Roach, the president of General Motors, went down and apologized publicly to Nader in front of Congress. Nader missed the apology. He didn't have a car and he couldn't get a cab that morning. Kid thee not. So anyway, the book became a bestseller overnight with all this publicity, and it really created one of the two great growth industries of late 20th century America. One of them exists right here. It's called technology, but the other one is called lawsuits. And the Corvair really redefined product liability law. And you guys all remember the McDonald's hot coffee case in 1994 or 5. All those legal precedents were set by the Corvair litigation of the 1960s. This car really had a profound impact on American life, including a whole new attitude toward the American government of regulating industry, not just the auto industry, but wide swaths of American industry. And I even argue in this book, frankly, that the Corvair played a major role in determining the outcome of the presidential election of 2000 between George W. Bush and Al Gore. This is the Hanging Chads election. It's quite simple. I mean, Bush won the state of Florida by less than 2,000 votes. Ralph Nader ran as an independent and got 95,000 votes in Florida that year. I think it's safe to say, at any speed, that if Nader had not been on the ballot, most of those votes would have gone to Gore instead of Bush. So 31 years later, this flawed car was still influencing American life in many ways. You all know this one, the Mustang. The name was inspired by a fighter plane, the P-51 Mustang, not by the horse. But in 1964, when this car was introduced, Ford decided that not enough people, especially young people, the target market, would remember the P-51 Mustang, so they adopted the horse. Basically, this car was nothing more and nothing less than a really hot, sexy body put on top of the chassis of the boring old Ford Falcon. I mean, it's really what it was. So you'll see that the title of this chapter is Turning a Librarian into a Sex Pot, right? Now, why did I choose that title? And pardon me if I offend anyone here, but this is how people talked in those days. So in 1964, after this car was a runaway success, the Detroit Free Press sent reporters in to do a retrospective at Ford, how the Mustang became such a smash hit. And they interviewed a former college professor named Cy Marshak, who was head of market research at Ford. And he told the reporter in these words, and it's in the Free Press article, "Let me put it to you this way. You take a woman, okay, and you have her hair in a bun, and you flatten out her chest, you flatten out her behind, and you put her in sneakers, and what do you have? You have the school librarian. Take that same woman, you let her hair down, you pat out her chest, you pat out her behind, put her in spiked heels, and what do you have? A sex pot." That's what we did with a car. Now, anyone who said that in corporate America today would be keel-hauled, down to the HR department and put through weeks of sensitivity training, unless they were fired, by the way, which probably would be a kinder fate. Anyway, three key people behind this car were Lee Iacocca, of course, Hal Sperlich, and Don Fry. Don passed away a couple years ago, and when I interviewed him at his home in Evanston, he was in failing health, but he took me out to the garage and showed me his original 64.5 Mustang. And it was like he was 20 years younger. I mean, there was a twinkle in his eye. It's probably one of the most memorable, certainly one of the most memorable interviews in 40 years of journalism. It was remarkable, the emotions this car evoked in that man. So don't forget Iacocca and Sperlich, because we're going to see them in the future. This is not Spock, okay? That is John Z. DeLorean, who launched the Pontiac GTO in 1964, the same year as the Mustang. It was basically just a big engine in the body of the compact Pontiac Tempest. But when you think about it, even though the Mustang and the GTO were in the same year, they really sort of captured different halves of the 60s. I mean, the first half of the 60s were more the good half, if you will. They were all about civil rights and the Beatles and the Mustang. The late 60s got a little darker, okay? we had urban riots, we had the Rolling Stones, the bad boy band, and we had the GTO, the bad boy car. I mean, GTO drivers really weren't, they were rebels, but not like Volkswagen Beetle rebels. I mean, they didn't want to raise anyone's consciousness. They just wanted to raise hell, okay? And so DeLorean took advantage of this. He was GM's resident rebel. He resigned in 1974, 73, excuse me. The GTO died about a year later, undone by high gas prices and the environmental movement. But it really kicked off the whole muscle car era. But it left us with a wonderful song by Ronnie and the Daytonas, Little GTO, which is all about the car with 3 deuces and a 4-speed, the 3 deuces being the 3 2-speed carburetors that were lined up sequentially under the hood to provide the extra horsepower. DeLorean, when you think about it, really created 2 time machine cars. One was the car in Back to the Future, and the other was the GTO, which is a great collector's item today. It sort of brings a lot of people my age, and sort of relive their youth a little bit with the GTO. Not that I was a hellraiser. The 1970s. The 1970s were not a good decade in America, right? We had the Iranian hostage crisis. We had 2 oil shocks. We had Watergate. We had defeat in Vietnam. Stagflation, inflation, bell-bottom pants, Donnie and Marie, all kinds of stuff you'd rather forget, right? People wanted to get practical again. The GTO is out, and along comes this little Japanese company, Honda, which was, a 3rd or 4th tier car company in Japan. It only saw its way of growth by growing in the American market. So it sold motorcycles here, then it built a motorcycle factory. 30 years ago this year, it started building cars in Ohio. And mark my words, that was a watershed year and a watershed event in American industrial history, because it really brought globalization to the American economy in a very big way, in a very visible way. Honda, when it built the Accord, it was the first foreign nameplate to be successfully manufactured in America. Now there are more than 24 German, Korean, and Japanese car factories in America. Within a decade, the Accord became the best-selling American automotive car nameplate. So it was remarkable. And it really came on top of, it was all part of that American renewal in the 1980s that followed the very difficult years of the 70s, years that might have been captured by a car I did not include in this book, but almost did, which was the AMC Gremlin. Suffice it to say that it was introduced on April Fool's Day, 1970, and it was designed on the back of a Northwest Airlines air sickness bag. I kid thee not. Moving along here, this is not the cover of Sports Illustrated. This is the cover of Car and Driver in magazine in May 1983 about the soon-to-be-launched Chrysler minivan. Also the work of Lee Iacocca and Hal Sperlich. So just think about this. In 1964, Iacocca and Sperlich caught America's baby boom generation at a critical period of their lives. They were just coming of age. They were getting their driver's licenses, going to college, that sort of thing. 20 years later, exactly 20 years later, in 1984, what had happened? This baby boom generation had grown up, gone to college, gotten haircuts, taken a shower, they went out and got jobs, they got married, they had children. Not always in that order, okay, but it all sort of happened. And Iacocca and Sperlich, who had been fired at Ford, now at Chrysler, caught this same generation again 20 years later at another critical juncture. It was just incredible what they did, how they captured the baby boomers twice at really interesting periods. The minivan, and no one really predicted this at the introduction, became a big political symbol in the 90s, became the symbol of soccer moms, whom the political pundits deemed to be a rising political force. In fact, In the 96 presidential election between Bill Clinton and Bob Dole, newspapers sent reporters out to interview minivan driving mothers at soccer games. And one reporter told a woman in the Bay Area here, he said, how does it feel to be a political force? And she said, well, I got to go home and I got to thaw something for dinner tonight. I don't think I have time to be a political force today. Chrysler was so enamored of this, by the way, that it actually drew up storyboards for a commercial that showed an embryonic minivan growing inside a mother's womb. Mercifully, that commercial never made it on the air, and we can all be thankful for that. I drive one of these cars, so I love them. This is the title of this chapter is the BMW 3 Series, The Rise of the Yuppies and the Road to Arugula. I think you kind of get it, right? I mean, the whole definition of luxury was changing. You had yuppies who were coming into their 30s and 40s. They were into a different kind of luxury than their parents were. Their parents were into ornamental, ostentatious luxury. These people were, yuppies were into more functional luxury. They were the kind of people who were going out and buying, vibration dampening Rossignol skis and that kind of stuff. And along came the BMW, which really appealed to that with its wonderfully tight suspension and steering and handling. It was just a remarkable sort of thing. There's a lot of alphabet soup sociology going on in the 80s. There were yuppies, young urban professionals, right? And then dinks, remember those? Double income, no kids. And after dinks, there were orchids, one recent child hideously in debt, okay? And then after the orchids, there were sitcoms, single income, 2 children, oppressive marriage, okay? People talked like that back then, what can I tell you? One of the great things about doing this chapter was I ran across some guys who were in their 60s in college, and they were driving Beetles and microbuses in their hippie years, and one actually played in a band that toured with 11 Spoonful. I know I'm dating myself when I say 11 Spoonful, sorry, but 20 years later, he's an M&A lawyer driving a Beamer, okay? So his personal and automotive journeys were sort of intertwined. He went from hippie to yuppie, and from Beetle to Beamer. I mean, it was this remarkable sort of, as he said, I'm a walking caricature. And he sort of was. Anyway, along comes the next chapter in this book. Really is about the Jeep. Began in World War II as the general purpose vehicle, GP, and thus the name Jeep. After the war, the Jeep was basically a marginal vehicle in American life for really until the late 1980s. So basically 40 years. It struggled to find a post-war. The Jeep had more trouble than most GIs adjusting to the post-war era. Let's put it that way. But then Lee Iacocca said, we're going to buy it from Renault. Was controlled by Renault at the time. And he caught, again, he had a great sense of trends in America. This whole wilderness outdoor thing was just beginning, but it wasn't really real wilderness. It was like indoor rock climbing gyms, Just think about that, indoor rock climbing gyms, right? By the way, Jeep was not the only company that was discovering this. I mean, the J. Peterman catalog, they were selling, Wyoming Duster coats in Wall Street, where they were a fashion statement. They weren't terribly useful. LL Bean did a lot of what it called mainstreaming of products. They found that a lot of their outdoor specialty gear really, if you just tweaked it a little bit, would sell to a far broader audience, including, backpacks. Backpacks used to be teardrop shape. It's much better ergonomically for long hikes in the wilderness, but it wouldn't hold textbooks, school books, so they squared them off and they sold a lot more backpacks. So that's what, the Jeep really became, this whole mainstream thing, even though, as we all know, very few people took them off-road. I mean, they drove them to the mall. They made, daring crack of dawn runs to Starbucks, and that's what it was all about. there was an anti-SUV backlash that ironically came from both the left and the right wing of the American spectrum, the environmentalists and religious fundamentalists. The religious groups started a advertising campaign that had the theme and the headline, "What would Jesus drive?" I did some research on this in the Bible. Let me just put it this way, there was no reference to Jeep, which was probably just as well in the Bible because it would have raised more fundamental questions. Ironically, and sort of the Jeep ended up being owned by the Germans as part of Daimler Chrysler, and then now by the Italians as part of Fiat and Chrysler, the very same two countries that this Jeep had helped to defeat during World War II. I mean, you could not make this up. This is the F-150 Harley-Davidson edition. It's for guys who want to drive their Harley bikes and their Harley trucks to Harley weekend road rallies, basically. I mean, most of these people are accountants, to be honest with you. But this is what they do. And I just loved writing about the pickup truck's sort of evolution from a fringe vehicle into the mainstream of American society because it paralleled the rise of country music, which is another interest of mine. It all started in 1970 with both pickup trucks and country music. The Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour, the Johnny Cash Show. Loretta Lynn became popular, not just a country artist, but a mainstream artist. One of my favorites is Joe Diffie, who wrote a couple of great songs, one titled Pickup Man, the double entendre, sort of obvious. My favorite actually is Leroy the Redneck Reindeer. Leroy drives a pickup truck, and you can listen to the song on YouTube and you'll hear the story. Anyway, Ford really led the way in making pickup trucks designer items, which is really kind of fun. I mean, so you had the Harley-Davidson edition, you had the SVT Lightning, which actually could, frankly go head-to-head with the BMW. The King Ranch edition of the S-Series, I mean, it's amazing. The seats have more leather than most cows, I'll tell you. I mean, it's remarkable. And of course, pickup trucks also became, as minivans had, a political symbol in this whole red state, blue state thing. In 2010, when Scott Brown won the special election for the U.S. Senate in Massachusetts to replace Ted Kennedy, the late Ted Kennedy, his signature campaign thing was driving his used pickup truck around the state. And so when Obama called him to congratulate him on the night of his election, he said, "Mr. President, would you like me to drive the truck down to Washington so you can see it?" And of course, his supporters got a big laugh out of that line when he told them. 10 months later, the midterm congressional elections, there's a candidate for Congress in Tennessee who actually advertised himself as a truck-driving, shotgun-shooting, Bible-reading, crime-fighting, family-loving country boy. This guy was a Democrat. It is true. He lost. But anyway, I mean, pickup trucks, and the other thing about pickup trucks is that Billy Carter, President Jimmy Carter's younger brother, used pickup trucks to tell the national press, to educate the national press about the difference between good old boys and rednecks. And he explained, he said, a good old boy is someone that drives down the road in their pickup truck and drinks beer like I do and puts them in a litter bag. A redneck's one that throws them out the window. So now you all know. And finally, the last car in the book really is the Toyota Prius. So we're back again from, more pretension and all that sort of thing to practicality. It was launched in 1997 in Japan, 3 years later in the US. One of the more interesting little anecdotes from the launch of the Prius was Toyota had very low sales expectations, so you had to wait months to get your first Prius after you ordered it, even though they only sold 12,000 that year in the US. So to sort of keep customers mollified, they sent them little gifts every month, like little mouse pads and that sort of thing. My favorite was a rear window decal that said, "Eat my voltage." And it was not cleared by senior management. They sort of freaked out when they saw this, and it was, you've all heard of car recalls. This was the first decal recall in automotive history. Anyway, the breakthrough came with the second generation Prius in 2003, and two things were important in this, right? I mean, one was the larger, roomier Prius with the more distinctive styling. You could spot it right away. And the second thing, of course, was that Hollywood discovered the Prius. I mean, at the Oscars that year, all those movie stars that had been driving up in Lincoln Town cars the year before, they were just crawling over themselves, you know, to come to the Oscars in the Prius, you know, so they could show their dedication to the environment, along with, you know, being dedicated to impossibly white teeth and all that kind of stuff. And so Toyota was very smart about this. What they did was they actually lent Priuses to the Oscars, and it was like worth millions and millions and millions of dollars in advertising. It was remarkable. So the Prius sales took off. In 2005, they topped 100,000 cars for the first year. One of my favorite pieces of research for this book actually occurred as an incident that occurred right in this area. March 28th in 2007, there was a guy arrested on the freeway for going more than 100 miles an hour in the Bay Area in his Prius. And the guy that writes, the journalist who writes the Mr. Roadshow column for the San Jose Mercury News, a great column, by the way, hopped on the story because the offender's name was Steve Wozniak. So this is big news. So he fires off an email to the Woz and says, is it true you were arrested for going 105 in your Prius? And the Woz fires back an email that says, not true, 104. So this dialogue goes back and forth a little bit. And what happens finally, Mr. Roadshow says, well, how did the Prius feel going 104? How did it handle? And Wozniak writes back this email that says, you know, I was surprised. It really was pretty good. It's kind of like my Hummer. Okay. Go figure. You know, I bet he has a Mac and a PC at home if he can, you know, have a Prius and a Hummer. I don't know. Maybe he roots for the Yankees and the Red Sox or whatever. So anyway, that really sort of completes the 15 cars that I think had a big impact. Again, they're not the best or the worst cars. They're cars that I think had a definable, measurable impact on how we live and think as a people. And just one final remark before I close here. You know, people said, well, what, you know, 5 years from now, if you write, you know, add another chapter to the book, well, what would be the 16th car? And, you know, I don't know. I mean, it might not even be a car. It might be a concept. Something like Zip Cars, you know, which is this very successful car sharing service. And, you know, I have no idea if you people living here in Silicon Valley would know better. I think if someone will sort of, you know, do some sort of a merger between eHarmony and Zip Cars, and we'll have eHarmonyZipcar.com. You heard it here first, okay? But anyway, I can tell you whatever it is, the car will continue to play a huge role in reflecting and shaping American life and society. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. You've been very gracious as an audience.
Now I'd like to welcome our Q&A moderator for the evening, R.B. Brenner. R.B. is a lecturer on the faculty of Stanford's graduate program in journalism, and prior to his arrival at Stanford, he held several top editing positions at the Washington Post and was one of the primary editors for the Post coverage of the Virginia Tech shootings and was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2008. R.B., thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I feel like in the spirit of Paul's book, that I should disclose that I was a Prius owner for 4 years. So I was an insufferable driver, according to the last slide, and recently purchased a Volvo two-door coupe. So I think I'm moving to be a yuppie.
There you go, right.
So that's good. Don't let the 3x5 cards fool you. This is going to be very informal. We really want this to be a conversation that involves as many of you as possible. So we're going to begin with just a few questions up here, and then there's a microphone that'll be circulating. So just raise your hand and jump in with questions. So Paul, you mentioned the gremlin, but in the afterword of the book, you say that people assume the hard decisions were the cars to include, but in many ways, the toughest decisions were those you left out. What were a few others beside the gremlin that you really wrestled with?
Well, one of them was the 57 Chevy, which is an iconic, great automobile. Ed Cole, the father of the Corvair, really developed that, and it put a lot of life and pizzazz back into the Chevy lineup. I mean, Ed Cole used the word intrigue. We have a little intrigue here. That was his word for sex appeal. And it was a great car. And I love the color schemes. Remember the old charcoal and coral color schemes, the two-tone. But, I thought, even though it was an important car for the industry and a great car, can I really point to any definable way that we live or think differently as a people because of the 57 Chevy? And if you're going to have two cars of the 50s that sort of really symbolize that exuberance, that post-war prosperity, that sky's the limit era, I think it's got to be the Corvette and it's got to be Tailfins.
I'm going to take you back to sort of your introduction to the automotive industry. You were working for the Wall Street Journal, I believe in the Cleveland Bureau, and they inform you that they want you to move to Detroit.
I know, Cleveland and then Detroit. I know.
And in your book, you write about that, your initial impression, and you say, I felt like an anthropologist living among exotic natives who worship strange gods called multi-valve engine, 0 to 60, and pound-feet torque. So as a journalist slash anthropologist, trying to sort of figure out this culture beyond just deciphering the lingo, what were sort of some of the keys for you in kind of really understanding the culture of Detroit and the automotive industry?
That's a great question. And I think one of the strengths of the Journal was having a news bureau there where you actually became immersed in the culture. And, my kids played on soccer teams with the kids whose, fathers were engineers at Ford and all that sort of thing. I think that was an important part of it. A lot of it was just getting out and socializing around the city and talking to people and sort of soaking up their values and going to events that were sort of inevitably automotive related, if you will, social events. And some of the things were sort of strange. I mean, I'd go to press conferences about topics that I knew would be of little interest because I just wanted to meet people. I mean, they'd have press conferences to, show the shape of the new hubcaps on next year's models. I didn't really care. But, talking to the people who developed the hubcaps, you saw their passion for it, if you will, and it just sort of, you gained an appreciation for their way of, their worldview. The other important thing, by the way, was getting out of Detroit regularly. In other words, traveling and sort of getting a non-Detroit-centric view of what automobiles meant. Because, it is it's the hometown industry in Detroit. It's like politics in Washington, okay. So I think it was a balance between being immersed in it, but getting out to clear my head occasionally.
We met with some of our graduate journalism students earlier in the day and found that for them, cars weren't as central to sort of their lives as maybe it was when we were growing up. They more identified with consumer electronic devices, the iPad or the iPhone. Do you feel like, what are the implications of this for even popular culture? Are there going to be songs that are going to have cars in them or films? Is this going to be a lasting sort of change in our culture?
Well, I mean, I think yes, it will be a lasting change. Will it eradicate automobiles? I don't think so. I mean, there is still something very special about your personal freedom of mobility. I mean, even the existence of zip cars basically says that people who don't want to own a car still want to use a car. That's actually a remarkable pro-automotive statement, not an anti-automotive statement in many ways. And look, I mean, the Beach Boys, had their song Shut Down. I don't think I've heard a song yet called Download, right? I mean, at some point, this will creep into music, and it already is in movies in many ways. But, I think personal mobility is something that people value around the world. And you see it in emerging societies. You saw after the Berlin Wall fell when Eastern Germans went out and bought used West German cars. You couldn't buy a used car in Western Germany for the next 2 years. I mean, it's remarkable.
Is the microphone out there? Why don't we have it circulating and go to the audience for some questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, is it on? Okay. First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I really enjoyed it. One of the things I'm trying to understand a bit more in how far is the automobile an expression of the culture, i.e. it's sort of an effect of some underlying cultural current that the designers harnessed, and then how far did it actually create the current? Is it a cause or an effect of the cultural changes that you're talking about?
I really wrestle with that question. That's a great question. And the best I could really say after sort of months of sort of pondering this was it's sort of both. And it's sort of like this question, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So in some cases, I think the Model T actually reshaped American culture. I think the Corvair actually reshaped American culture. I think Tailfins more or less reflected American culture instead of reshaped it. So it really depends on the vehicle and the times. So it really happened both ways.
Others?
Thank you. I'm curious about the selection process you used in selecting the car for your book jacket.
I didn't choose it. The book. It was the artist at Simon and Schuster. I saw it. I loved it right away. It's actually a 1940 Cadillac 60 Special. It's not in the book, but just the lines of the car were so perfect, and the way the grille sort of invites you to turn the book cover and lead into the book, I thought was great. So, usually authors sort of fuss about book covers, and you go back and forth, and you fight with your publisher, and you fight about the subtitle, you fight about everything. I saw this whole thing, and I said, great, do it.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is actually.
What I've been reading recently is that the most recent demographic, the people who are now first able to get driving licenses and buy cars, are not doing so at the rate that certainly our generation did. They're doing it later, they're postponing it, they're less involved with their cars. What are the implications of that on future automotive development?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the proportion of young people of car driving age who have licenses, driver's licenses, is going down. And I think part of it is because people are more attracted to big cities. I think we're in a society in which, your future economic prosperity depends more and more on education. I mean, we all know that here intuitively. So people are in school longer, which means delaying car purchases, that sort of thing.
The way I read it is that there's a decrease in interest or passion, I couldn't wait until I got my driving license. I just had to have a car.
Well, if I can be direct about it, I think some of it has to do with sex. In an earlier era, a lot of people had their first sexual experiences in automobiles. Times have changed, now it's like, mom and dad, we're going upstairs. Not quite, but, so I think, that really is a big part of it. And also there's a lot of new toys around, technological toys that people are into, that it's just another diversion for a lot of people.
I thought your historical comparison of, or contrast between cars and consumer electronics was interesting. One of the primary functions of cars in my generation was self-expression. Mm-hmm. Pretty hard to look at consumer electronics as a matter of self-expression when, half the world's population has iPhones. What's going to replace the car as a means of self-expression?
Well, first of all, I think consumer electronics do have a sort of a self-expression role. Carrying a MacBook Air around is cooler than carrying a Dell around, okay? It just is. Am I wrong? Okay. Not here, right? Not here, okay. Thank God I didn't say it the other way around here. So I'm not sure it's entirely different. And also, it's not just the device you're carrying around, but it's what social networks you're members of, and what kind of things you're doing online and all that sort of thing. So I think there is an element of social expression in consumer electronics and that sort of thing. But you're right. The car. One of the reasons I think that cars will, despite this relative dilution in some quarters of their impact, will maintain a huge impact is because it continues to be a vehicle for self-expression. There's just other ways to express that these days, but I think cars will remain uniquely powerful statements.
What happens to the idea of a car or the design? Let's even focus on the design of a car. When we take it a step further than Zipcar, we may look at, for example, Better Place's idea or vision, which is you purchase a car that you're going to actually have access to all the time, but as a service. Batteries, parts, everything is swapped out. What happens to your ability, to express yourself through that car, to customize it? It's a totally different ballgame.
Well, it's true, but there's always been a big part of the car buying population that was not really interested in customizing or expressing themselves through their cars, honestly. I mean, there are passionate automotive enthusiasts who really want to express themselves to their cars. And there's a lot of people who, they just want to get from point A to point B. Yeah, exactly. So I think that will continue, and I think the people who will be the people most likely to use Zipcar and these other services will be the people who really want the utility, and not the, not to wax it on Saturdays and all that sort of thing.
There's a hand in the back. If we can get the microphone. I'll just run it. Great. While we do that, I'll throw one more in from up here. Paul, we had talked earlier about, you've been in the news business for 4 decades. Comparing the attitude the automotive industry had when it went through its own version of sort of disruptive technologies with the way the news business, particularly newspapers, has reacted to the internet and now social networks. Talk about the parallels there.
It's a remarkable parallel, RB. I mean, when you think about it, both industries went through huge disruptive forces. In the 1970s, the American auto industry, the disruptive force was called the Japanese, okay? They came in with a whole different philosophy of quality and that sort of thing. And the reaction of the American car companies was first to really blame the customers. Well, wait a minute, these people aren't patriotic, they're buying Japanese cars. And that, didn't really move many minds, honestly. Fast forward to the turn of the century when the internet became powerful, a disruptive force on the newspaper industry, and even the news industry, but mostly the newspaper industry. And the first thing journalists did was they went into denial. They basically blamed the customer, like Detroit did. They said, well, gee, these are the uneducated masses just aren't interested in public affairs. I mean, it's nonsense. News consumption is higher than ever these days. Just the newspaper business model has become unsustainable. I mean, there'll be some exceptions to that, but a lot of the newspaper business model has become unsustainable. So I think this is going to be it already is a painful, disruptive period in the newspaper industry, but there'll be new business models coming out of it. In fact, guess what? There already are. Sir.
Yes, okay. Could you comment a little bit on your relationship with the publisher and what it was like to make the book? And could you also tell us what it would take for Cardinal Publishing to persuade you to do Grand Prix and Formula One cars before NASCARs in your next book? Thank you.
I see. I love it. Okay. Simon & Schuster was wonderful to work with. I just can't say enough good things about them. This book, the history of this book is a little strange because I started it 5 years ago at the end of 2007, spring of 2007. But then, about a year and a half later, late 2008, everything started to hit the fan in Detroit. And so I basically said, hey, can I take a time out and write another book? This book was half finished. And they didn't have to let me off the hook on doing that, but they were very generous with that and let me write another book called Crash Course about the bailouts and bankruptcies of General Motors and Chrysler. And then I came back into this book. The editors were great. They were wonderful to work with, easy to work with. I didn't write this book from the first chapter to the last chapter. For some reason, I cannot explain why. I started in the middle with the Mustang and the GTO and worked outwards on both ends. It's just how my mind worked, I guess. Sorry. Yeah, Shane.
Paul, thanks for yet another wonderful book. Can't wait to finish it. I have a different question. Cars being an object of desire 50 years back, I think, when we dream, we always dream about things we can't attain. Nowadays, cars are so easy to own. and so easy to buy and get rid of. What do you imagine 50 years down the road we'd be dreaming about?
Well, I don't think I'll be dreaming about anything 50 years down the road. I'm not sure what the actual things we'll be dreaming about, but I think it'll be the same things that sort of drive human emotions today. That is the desire to connect and reach out to other human beings, the desire for freedom, the desire for personal mobility. So what other sorts of devices that will be, or appliances or machines that will be attached to those dreams, I don't know 50 years from now, to be honest with you, Shane. But I think whatever we do dream about, it'll be about things that are directly related to those themes.
Well, unfortunately, I'm told we're at our time here. I'll just close with one quick one. You talked at the very beginning about this tug of war between the practical and the pretentious.
Right.
What do you see over the near horizon of sort of how that might manifest itself in the next sort of models of cars?
Well, I think we're definitely back to a more practical mode, given the state of the economy in the world. And I think, look, we're in for, I'll be going over to Athens next month as part of my duties for Reuters, and it's the European economic situation is very scary and has the ability to really hurt this U.S. economy very badly. So I think we're in a practical phase, but I think, look, even in a practical phase, people are going to want to dress up practical cars in innovative ways. I mean, I'm driving a little Fiat Cinquecento out there, which is an inexpensive car, but boy, is it fun.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.